In previous videos, we looked at the scope of the revenue standards as well as step 1 through 3. In step 2, we identified the performance obligations, and in step 3, we determined the transaction price. We're now going to move to step 4, which is where we allocate the transaction price to the performance obligations we previously identified. As with all these videos, what you see on your screen is the software that we developed to help companies understand and implement the requirements of the revenue standards, both IFRS 15 as well as ASC 606. I'll be using this software, which is located at tasglobal.co, to communicate the requirements of the standards. So looking now at step 4, what you're seeing is asking a question to list a standalone selling price and method for determining it for each performance obligation. The idea is that the transaction price that we previously determined in step 3 will be allocated to each performance obligation based upon its relative standalone selling price. So if you're unclear what the standalone selling price is, you can use the question mark button here and it'll bring up the guidance. So the standalone selling price represents the price at which an entity would sell a promised good or service separately to a customer. If it's unclear exactly how to implement that, you can select the I button here and it will bring up an example. But in our previous examples, we identified software license, winning of updates, and tech support as being the performance obligations. So there are 4 different methods that the standard allows for determining what the standalone selling price would be. You'll see these in the drop-down menu here. Directly observable is the best case scenario. So if you have a similar or even the same product that you sell in a different market or even the same market, then you may have a directly observable standalone selling price. That would be the best evidence available. Absent that, another selection there would be adjusted market assessment. So if you have a similar product, or if a competitor perhaps has a similar product in a near market or a similar market, then you may be able to reference the pricing that they're using there and then adjust that pricing for your market specific circumstances to determine or estimate a standalone selling price. A third approach is an expected cost plus a margin. So if you have a standard markup, say 30%, perhaps you're selling a new product, maybe you can estimate the standalone selling price by estimating what your cost would be and then applying your standard markup. There is a fourth approach that is allowed, although it's allowed only in limited circumstances. I won't spend a lot of time on it here because it's really fairly rare that you use it. But in some instances, if you know in our example 2 of the 3 performance obligations, but you don't have a standalone selling price for the third, you could use a residual approach. But I will emphasize that's in relatively limited circumstances. You can select the question mark or the I, and it will give you some more details on when that actually can be used. The standalone selling prices I've entered here are just as an example, just so we can go forward through the example here. So the next question you're being asked is saying the information provided suggests there's a discount of $155,000. In general, the discount or the standalone selling price is allocated to each performance obligation based upon its relative standalone selling prices. However, in certain circumstances, if there is observable evidence that the discount relates to less than all of the performance obligation, then you may allocate that discount to less than all of the performance obligations. For purposes of our example, I'm going to say yes here. So what it's asking now is it's saying, okay, if you have objective evidence that the discount relates to less than all of the performance obligations and allocating it to less than all of the performance obligations will meet the allocation objectives of the standard, then enter that amount there. So I will just enter a random amount for purposes of our example, and then we can proceed. Similarly, variable consideration, again, in general, just like standalone selling price, just like the transaction price, is allocated to all performance obligations based upon its relative standalone selling price in most instances. However, the questions being asked here is, do the terms of the variable consideration relate specifically to efforts to satisfy a specific performance obligation or to transfer distinct good or service? So if there is evidence that, and there are specific criteria to be referenced, again, using the question mark and I can give you some more detail on that, but if the variable consideration relates to less than all of the performance obligation, in certain instances, you may allocate it to less than all the performance obligations. So the second question is asking if allocating it to less than all would meet the allocation objectives of the standard. If you say yes, then you're asked to allocate it specifically. I'll just put a number here for purposes of our example. What you're seeing now is a summary. So you see the standalone selling price on the left, the relative standalone selling price percentages, the allocated the allocation, and then you see the specific allocation of variable. And then the far right column shows you what the allocated transaction price is.